And now we will move on to Nick Nesbitt, who is a professor at Princeton University and is the author of a number of very interesting and important publications, one of the most recent being a volume on rereading Althusser, Reading Capital. It's entitled The Concept in Crisis, Reading Capital Today, which has articles by a number of important scholars in that area, including Althusser and Badiou and Nick. Today's presentation is called La structure est pourrie, Althusser and Badiou from Concept to Model.
Okay,
thanks.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Institut Français, to Yana, to the Academy of Sciences, Michal, and to Princeton University as well. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think very quickly I want to develop in a specific direction some of the propositions that Patrice just put forward regarding structuralism, regarding the event and the question of whether 68 can constitute a theoretical event, an événement théorique, and I want to do so in a sense that both focuses in on a specific dimension of what we call structuralism and a specific moment and form of that large theoretical grouping, structuralism, and also maybe beginning to draw a link between 68 and 89 that I think many of the other papers today will go on to develop in a lot more detail. But let me just put that forward. I'll try to be brief, and I'll move right ahead then. So these remarks, as Joe suggested, come out of a volume that I've just finished, an edited volume on Althusser's Reading Capital, Lire la Capitale, from 1965. And in that volume, we, along with the other people contributing, we go back and we look at this 50-year-old book and try to think about both the specificities of its intervention within a moment and a situation in 1965 as a specific proposition regarding not just anti-humanism, but also, more specifically, a specific way to read, of course, literally read Marx's Capital in that conjuncture of the mid-60s that Patrice was referring to in the post-war development of France and Europe and modernization and technocratization, etc. And the beginning, I would say specifically, of a mode of reading Marx's Capital that we could call conceptual or categorical, rather than specifically a humanist reading that characterized other mid-century, post-war existentialist variations of Marxism. And I think that I would say conceptual rather than structural mode of reading Marx's Capital has carried forward into the present and has been developed, and I want to end up there as well in my talk, but I think it's important. One of the things that I wanted to do in that work was to draw some of the thinkers involved in that project, not just Althusser, of course, but Jacques Rancière and Pierre Macheret, and tangentially Althusser Badiou, who wasn't in the volume but was part of that group as well. This mode of reading and of a critique of the present, not just capitalism specifically, but more generally, I think, a mode of critique of the present as conceptually oriented and toward the process of building and constructing conceptual models that can elaborate a critique of the present. I think that begins with in an important sense with this intervention, Reading Capital, 1965. And so in relation to that moment, of course, 68 constitutes in some sense, as Patrice has suggested, an event, a rupture, but one that is not necessarily in pure disjunction from that immediately preceding intervention. I think I agree in a very strong sense that there is a way in which that critical intervention is carried forward into and beyond the context of May 68. But then what I want to suggest, and what I'd like to do in these remarks, is look at a specific short text of Alain Badiou's that he presents around the moment of May 68 itself. And I think even though that text itself is very punctual and addressing a single problem, the concept, what he calls the concept of model, I think that it allows us to make a broader typology of this period stretching from something like a beginning of that conceptual Althusserian structuralism around 1960 or so, with the writings that would become for Marx, through and beyond 89. And so what I'm proposing are something like 3 periods that are divided by these moments of break and rupture, 68 and 89. A first one that is a particular structuralism, a sort of conceptual structuralism that for me is typified by 2 important collaborative projects and texts. As I said, Reading Capital from 65, but also then an important and less well-known journal, Cahiers pour l'analyse, that followed out of that project in those years, which specifically developed this conceptual orientation and the development of conceptual categories, their reflection, their formalization. I think that that's one way of understanding the project of Cahiers pour l'analyse, in which Althusser and many of his students, including Badiou, were direct contributors. That project was ended by May 68. Literally, the journal was stopped and never recommenced after May 68. But I think there's also a certain break that we could identify with 68 in this way. And I would say that then the succeeding period, 68 to 89, is something like an informal period of politics, politique de l'informel, a period of what Foucault and Deleuze famously called local politics, situated politics, of local situations, problems, interventions, rather than overarching larger attempts to re-articulate the structural determinants of a given social configuration or order. And then 1989, I think, in this optic, in this light, in any case, opens onto, and here I'm going to be focusing on Badiou's thought as it develops after 88 and 89, a certain suture of structure or conceptual formalization and the problem of practice, a sort of axiomatic formalism. And so what I'm proposing is that we discuss a very brief text of Badiou's from 1968. There are 2 lectures that he gave that have been republished as Le Concept de Modèle, the concept of model. And I think it's an interesting text just simply historically, because he gave the first talk, and then May 68 intervened, and the second talk was canceled, and he never gave it. And so there's a sense in which the event and the events themselves of May 68 put an end to that process of formalization as Badiou conceptualizes it in these lectures. But I think it's even more, it's certainly interesting to reread those two talks today. Even more interesting, and my remarks are based not so much on the talks, but on the 2007 preface that Badiou wrote to the republication of the talks, that I think is fascinating. Badiou in the preface is talking about his own development as a thinker and the similarities and differences between what he thought about form models and formalization in '68, what he thinks about them after 1988 and being an event, and the different philosophical works he's put forward since then. But I think that those remarks are really fascinating in this broader sense, in that they point toward a certain categorization and typology of this historical period in these three moments that I'm suggesting. A period of formalization, 58 to 68, let's say, a period of informal politics, politique de l'informel, 68 to 89, and then an axiomatic politics, an axiomatic formalism that joins these two after 88 and 89. And so to go quickly, Badiou proposes here in these lectures, he's arguing against two different allied notions of the model, two understandings of the model. The one positivist and empiricist, in which the model, and this is coming out of logical positivism, Carnap, and before him Frege, of course, in which the model is something like the diagram of an empirical given. The diagram of an empirical given, or a representation of the real. A positivist, empiricist understanding of model. Or secondly, he's also arguing, Badiou, against a sort of vulgar Platonism, in which the model is something like the pure idea, and the empirical would be simply the copy or realization of that pure idea. And so Badiou proposes a third model of model, a sort of logical, mathematical formalism. And in a sense, his critique then of the concept of model is a critique of this logical positivist tradition in which, at the same time, from his later perspective in 2007, he doesn't say this, but I would say that those lectures are in fact a sort of culmination of that very positivism that he seeks to critique. It's in a sense, these lectures of 1968 are a sort of ultimate development of the famous idea of a philosophy of the concept that Jean Cavaillès first put forward in 1942 in his famous little book that he wrote from the Nazi prison on logic and the theory of sciences. And that platform for a philosophy of the concept against the phenomenological tradition, I think it finds a culmination not only in Badiou's work, in Althusser's work in Reading Capital, but in these very lectures. And in the sense that in the 1968 lectures, the model, in this concept of the model, Badiou's concept of the model, the letter or the symbol comes to constitute a sort of materialist inscription within being. As Badiou says, la donation du il y a. La donation du il y a. The giving, the being there of theirsness. A sort of ultra-materialist Fregeanism, I would say. And let me just give a little brief quote where Badiou synthesizes this critique of Frege, of this idea of a model, in his later book, Number and Numbers. He says, this is a later reflection back on the concept of model and Fregeanism. There exists, Badiou says, no deduction of number. It's solely a question of a fidelity to that which, in its inconsistent excess, is traced as a historical consistency in the interminable movement of mathematical refoundations. No mathematical concept can be inferred from experience, so anti-empiricism, nor do they propose themselves to any intuition, anti-intuitionism, nor, thirdly, do they submit to any deduction, so against Frege, against logical positivism, even a transcendental one. None of them amounts to the form of an object. These concepts arise from a decision whose written form is the axiom. So Badiou will turn to an axiomatic orientation that is precisely a rejection both of logical deduction, whose name is Frege, proper name might be Frege, and as well as an anti-empiricism, an axiomatic orientation. So we could say that model comes to constitute a sort of structural materialism of the letter or the sign in which ontology is subordinate to logic. In this philosophy of the concept, even stretching back, I would say, to the great Czech logician Bernard Bolzano. And I think we can say from Bolzano through Frege, through Cavaillés, through Descenty, Althusser, and the Badiou of '68, we have a sort of structural or logical materialism that then will be abandoned in 1988, 1989, for something we could call instead an ontological materialism, in which reflection on presentation, a discourse on ontology takes the place of the deduction of adequate logical categories. And so, and I'm going very quickly here, but maybe if there are aspects we can return to in the discussion if it's of interest. So what we see is a movement between this logical materialism that culminates in these lectures of 1968, that I think is a culmination of this whole long tradition, an anti-phenomenological tradition in thought from, I'm saying, Bolzano, Cavaillés, and Althusser and Badiou, to this axiomatic formalism, in which the process of formalization in Badiou's works such as Being an Event and Logics of Worlds, the process of formalization is retained, and mathematical formalization, but it becomes subordinate to ontology and philosophy, and mathematics simply is a subordinate, proper, and adequate mode to speak of being. It is not the donation, the giving of being itself, as we might say with Frege. So we have a turn then, after 1988 being the publication of Badiou's first major ontological work, Being an Event, and 1989, then I think there's an important link to develop here. Insofar as I think, and this Badiou suggested in a personal register in this preface, but I think in a larger sense, it's anyway a question for discussion today. To what extent, if we agree with this, to what extent did this period of what I'm calling political informalism, l'informe politique, or simply local politics from '68 to '89, to what extent does 1989 then mark a second rupture in which there's a certain recognition of a necessity to retain a process of formalization and reflection at a conceptual level, a certain structuralism, a certain maybe political variant of structuralism that is a sort of axiomatic formalism, that nonetheless is not a structuralism of fixed, unchanging, structural, essences, but rather an axiomatic one in which politics takes any given orientation as a decision, as a process of decision, as a contingency, as an openness onto freedom, but allies with that orientation a formal process of reflection. That is to say, literally and specifically, with 1989 and the coming triumph, generalization, let's say, of capitalism as a global sequence, to what extent then does it suddenly become imperative, necessary to carry forward political thought, to invent axiomatically politics adequate to the vast generalization and encompassing generalization of capitalism after 1989 as a totalization, a self-describing totalization anyway, of global society. I think precisely what we see is the necessity of revisiting and carrying forward into the post-89 period both a contingent axiomatic orientation toward politics, not based in a priori moralism or pre-given norms or normativity, but the capacity to orient oneself in relation, say, to universal categories, equality, justice, etc. And furthermore, specifically, this is something that is of interest to me, why I go back to reading Capital today. I think precisely Althusser's mode of reading Capital, this categorical, conceptual mode. Why? I think because precisely the speed and enormity of grasping and rapidity at which capitalism is dominating and transforming, particularly since the turn of the century, our experience is so overwhelming that it's very difficult, not to say impossible, with our existing categories from the 20th century to conceive of a politics that would truly be not just local politics, but also veritably anti-capitalist. To understand what that might mean implies, of course, understanding the forms, limits, structures of capitalism itself. And then I'll end on this. I think it's precisely what we see in reading Capital, what we see in these sorts of conceptual readings of Marx's Capital. I'm thinking of Moishe Postone, I'm thinking of Wertkritik, the value critique school of thought, Michael Heinrich, the Italian school, Max Tomba, Bellofiore, and also, though, this French tradition. I think that precisely in revisiting the conceptual categories that Marx developed in his critique of political economy in the 3 or 4 volumes of Capital, we can recover the basic elements that still today define the structure of structures that is capitalism, but it's a contingent structure. It's a structure of structures in which we see contemporary mutations of the orientation, the domination, the subordination of those various categories in ways that require us to step back and invoke a conceptual moment and process of reflection to be able to grasp precisely what it means to live in a period that I would call post-human capitalism, in which there's a general devalorization of the value of labor power itself. That is to say, the becoming infinitesimal, the becoming impossible for labor power itself to create surplus value in a context in which suddenly, incomprehensibly, everything, virtually everything, can be automated with the general elimination of living labor power. To grasp that process and then to put forward and to think politics in the contemporary intervention is precisely to require this, what I'm calling an axiomatic formalism. I'm not saying we have the resources, I'm not saying that Badiou carries that project forward, but rather that this sort of general philosophical project that sutures the axiomatic and with the process of formalization itself and conceptual reflection gives us the resources to begin to develop and carry forward such a refoundation, reconceptualization, reorientation of politics adequate to our contemporary conjuncture in its enormous, bewildering complexity. So I'll end there, and maybe there'll be more room for discussion later. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nick.